I'd like to welcome everyone to the Shir today, which we're going to be spending two parts on. The first part of the Shir is going to be discussing a little bit about Asarah Beteves itself, and the second part of the Shir will talk about making Kiddush and Havdalah and lighting candles. Today, Asarah Beteves is a very important fast day. It's different than the other fast days in some ways. Any other of the fast days that would come, let's say, for instance, if Tisha B'Av would land on Shabbos, so we push it off to Sunday. And if Shivas B'Tammuz would come on Shabbos, we push it off to Sunday. Interestingly enough, though, that we're not allowed to fast on Shabbos, if Asarah Beteves, which can fall on Friday, it can come on Friday, and it did, in fact, last year, come on Friday, we would fast on Friday into Shabbos. Because Asarah Beteves is of such great power that we would actually have to fast into Shabbos. And why is that? That's because it was the beginning that took a few years until it ultimately led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And in the 3 years that Nebuchadnezzar surrounded Yerushalayim from the 17th of Tammuz on, in those 3 years, had Klal Yisrael managed to do some tshuva, then there's no question that the destruction, which ultimately took place, would never have taken place. And those 3 years, therefore, gave an opportunity to the Jewish people to do the tshuva. We're under the impression a lot of times that when we fast on Asarah Beteves, we're fasting because of something that happened thousands of years ago. But Chazal tell us, and it's a Talmud Yerushalmi, that any generation in which the Beis HaMikdash is not rebuilt, it's as if that has been destroyed in our time. So we're not fasting, as Rav Shamshon Ferler says, for what happened 3,000 years ago. We're fasting because we're still in that matzah. We're still in that type of situation. And because we're still in that type of situation, that's why we fast in order to help us to do tshuva. And the halacha brings down that if somebody takes these days and fasts on these days, but doesn't do the ikr, and the ikr, of course, is the tshuva, then that person has grabbed the tafel and left apart the ikar, which means that person has taken the secondary and lost the main. Because the main purpose is to try to get better and to improve our situation individually, our communally Jewish situation, worldwide, and ultimately to make, therefore, the world better. And many of us aren't aware that the tiny incremental steps we take in our personal lives has a tremendous impact on the community and the world at large. It's almost, the best mashal would probably be taking a rock and throwing it into the lake. When you take a stone, a small stone, a little stone, and throw it into a tremendous lake, it makes a ripple effect throughout the entire body of water. What we do matters. What we do really counts. And consequently, our fasting and our doing tshuva does have value. It's interesting to note that the 8th, 9th, and 10th of Teves are very closely interrelated, and in the history of the Jewish people, events took place on the 8th, on the 9th, and on the 10th that are all combined. In the Slichas we just read, it mentions Ezra HaSofer. It happens to be that Ezra HaSofer died on the 9th day in the month of Teves. And when Ezra died, that was a tremendous day of mourning, because he was the one who brought Klal Yisrael back after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. So his death is mourned on the 9th day in the month of Teves. On the 8th day in the month of Teves, our Chazal tell us, was the Targum HaShivim, the translation of the Torah into Greek, which, according to our Chazal, so interesting, they use such a powerful expression. They say that the Targum HaShivim, the day that the Torah was translated by the Targum HaShivim, Kosher Yisrael, was as difficult for the Jewish people as the day of the worship of the Egel. That's awesome. That the worship of the Egel was such a terrible day for us, and here we're saying that the translation of the Torah into the vernacular at that time was a terrible, terrible blow to the Jewish people. Why is that? So the Sefer Todah gives a very interesting mashal. Rabbi Yoel Kitov says, he quotes Chazal, the mashal is like, you have a lion, a ferocious lion, and you take this lion and you put him in a cage. Somehow you subdue him, you tranquilize him, you capture him, you net him, and you put him in a cage. People now coming to the cage, when they look at the cage, they look at the lion sleeping in the cage and they say, this is not a ferocious animal. This is not a ferocious beast. I don't have to be afraid of him. Look at him. He's sleeping. There's nothing to worry about. He can't harm us. We've got him. So it was with the Torah. When the Torah was not available, unless one was committed to the Torah lifestyle, that is, they had to learn Aleph Beis. They had to learn Chumash from a Rebbe. They had to learn the Chazal and the stories. If they were not Jewish and they wanted to be Jewish, they had to take years and years, even today, of lessons in order to convert properly. So they get the hashrosha, they get the rootedness of the Torah, and they get the understanding of that rootedness, and they get an understanding of a complete emunah and bitachon in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When they get that, and then they come to the Torah, that is where there is a tremendous amount of emunah and bitachon, and the Torah then is open to them, and the Torah is recognized as being the awesome power it has. But once the Torah was translated into the vernacular, people started reading things, and they started making drushes of dofi, foolishness. They started misunderstanding the Torah. How is it possible to understand Torah without Chazal? So people were taking stories of the Torah and misusing them for the purposes that they weren't meant for. And they changed things, which is exactly what happened in the history of the Jewish people. As soon as the Torah was acceptable to all and available to all, it was perverted and it was destroyed. And that's why it's such a sad day. And for that reason, the 8th of Teves is also a day of mourning. And it's all combined into the fast of the 10th of Teves. There's a very interesting discussion by Rav Baruch Simon. He wrote a Sefer Imrei Baruch. He's a Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University, one of the big Talmidei Chachamim. And he quotes, in that Sefer, he quotes a discussion, another Sefer that has a very interesting approach on this particular idea of Asarah Beteves. He says, and the name of this Sefer is Beis Yishai. He quotes it and he says as follows: if you look through the history of the Jewish people, you'll notice that in the Gemara and Tainus, when it comes to, let's say, Tisha B'Av, so there were 5 terrible things that happened on Tisha B'Av. What was one of them? Going back to the Torah itself, the Meraglim. On Tisha B'Av, the Meraglim came back, and the Meraglim said a terrible thing about the land of Israel, and the Gemara records that Vayivku ha'am b'layla hahu, and the nation cried on that night. That night was Tisha B'Av. When it comes to Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, there's also a biblical reference to Shiva Asar B'Tammuz. What was that reference? That the Luchos, when Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai, it was the 17th day in the month of Tammuz. He went up on the 6th day in the month of Sivan. He came down on the 17th of Tammuz. So his coming down on the 17th of Tammuz was when he broke the Luchos. So the 17th of Tammuz has in it a tremendous problem for Klal Yisrael that goes back to biblical times. And then, when Shivas B'Tammuz, the walls were broken through in the time of the second base Hamikdash. Therefore, we fast on Shivas B'Tammuz. So he asked the question, so what happened on Asarah Beteves in biblical times, in the Torah's times, that would have an effect on later on that ultimately on Asarah Beteves, the siege of Yerushalayim would begin by Nebuchadnezzar. He has an unbelievable idea. He says, take a look. What is the mazel of the month of Teves? The mazel in the month of Teves is a gedi. A gedi is a goat. The mazel of the month of Teves is a gedi. How did the brothers come to Yaakov Avinu to tell him that Yosef was killed? The pasuk says, "Vayishchatu se'irizim," that they took a goat and they killed it. They took the coat of Yosef and dipped it in the blood, and they brought the coat to their father Yaakov. And by that event of the slaughtering of the goat, they got rid and sold Yosef. Says that sefer that the Imre Baruch quotes, the Beis Yishai, Lule Mistafina. If it weren't for the fact that I'm a little bit hesitant and afraid, I would posit that the sale of Yosef took place on Asarah Beteves, because Teves is the Mazel Gedi. And that Gedi was slaughtered in order to cover up the sale of Yosef. And the Beis Hamikdash destruction took place because of brothers not getting along, because of Klal Yisrael not capable of being united. So what's the tshuva that we need to do for Asarah Beteves? The tshuva we need to do for Asarah Beteves is we have to love every Jew. We're like a bunch of different bodies, but we have one neshama. We're all part of Klal Yisrael. And the mistake that was made with the sale of Yosef was the mistake that led to the destruction, ultimately, the basic things that we still mourn for today. And consequently, Asarah Beteves is such a powerful fast. It has so much in it. It's interesting to note that it's the shortest fast of all the fasts during the year, because not even 12 hours, actually, of fasting, which started, the earliest month, 5:40, up to 6:07, but it ends at 5:25, which is not even 12 hours by the earliest month. And yet it's the most powerful of fasts, because it has in it the seeds of ultimate tshuva and nebuch, if not the ultimate destruction. So we have an opportunity on this day of Asarah Beteves to do the best we can to try to overcome and help create a situation where we will be better off. The discussion in Halacha today that we're dealing with is a discussion first on Adlakas Neiros, and then on Kiddush and Havdalah, and also the Motzi. There's so many aspects of all of these laws that it's almost impossible to cover them all. I wanted to focus on things that people always ask questions about, and people sometimes need a little more fine-tuning in the halacha. The other day, I mentioned to someone about a very, very fine point of halacha. It's a small fine point of halacha. And I asked him, I said, if you could do me a favor, please, and do this, because that's the proper way to do it. And the person said to me in a sarcastic sort of way, but not meaning anything bad, he said, oh, Rabbi, you think that's going to really help bring Mashiach better? That's going to make the world a better place? That's not going to do it. So I said, you're right, it is a minor point. It is small. But the halacha is what makes the whole thing come out right. The success is in the details. When you buy, for instance, a birthday cake, and you want it to say happy birthday, and it's for a boy, and they write beautifully happy birthday in pink, what's the difference? It's a small minor item. It says happy birthday, and it says happy birthday Chaim, and the cake is a beautiful cake, and the taste is great, and it's going to be beautiful. It's a small little detail. But the small little detail, it just doesn't cut it. It makes it that there's something wrong and there's something missing. So sometimes, even small little details, and even if the name was in blue.